Hi, everyone. Welcome to Fireside Adoptees Constellation and Legislation Space. So we're very privileged today to have a great interview for you from Cameron Lee. Let me read a little bit about Cam's background here. Cam's work has been featured in National Council for Adoption, Christianity Today, University of Minnesota School of Social Work, and Center for Adoption Support and Education. Paired with his clinical practice, Cam serves as a training facilitator for the Permanency and Adoption Competency Certificate. His personal experience as an international adoptee from Korea informs and inspires his private practice, which is called Therapy Redeemed. Cam's book, The Adoptee's Journey from Loss and Trauma to Healing and Empowerment, addresses the intersection of adoption, faith, mental health, and social responsibility. His vulnerable insights stands honestly next to his professional presence, making Cam a transformative voice and force within the adoption community, the adoptee community, and throughout fields of advocacy and healthcare. Welcome to Fireside, Cam. So glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me, y'all. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to mostly focus on the well, about your adoption story, a little bit about your story as an adoptee, and then maybe talk about aspects of therapy and the unique perspective that you have there from your very informed training and the practice that you have there. So if we could start a little bit about your background as an adoptee, maybe when you were adopted, and we know you were from Korea, but do you know anything about the circumstances of your relinquishment or anything there?
Thanks for that question. I was born in Korea and with my parents for 3 years. And this was in the 80s. Father passed away in a tragic accident that I don't have all of the details to. I was able to get some of the details through my paperwork and with my mom during a reunion. Through that particular season, my mom went through this process of meeting with different folks, trying to raise me for a little bit, and then ultimately kind of recruited by a social worker who was part of the Eastern Child Welfare Services back, and decided that it was best to relinquish me into foster care and for international adoption. I was 3.5 years old, when I was flown from Seoul to Chicago and then made the drive up to Wisconsin, where I was raised by my 2 white adoptive parents for the rest of my life. I know that's a kind of a quick snap. I write a little bit more detail in the book, and we'll more about that today, but that's where it begins for me.
Great, thank you. Were there any other children in the family you grew up in?
I have a brother, biological, who's also adopted from Korea, younger than me.
And in terms of life growing up as an adoptee, growing up in a white family, for example, obviously you're out in the open, and it's very apparent, I'm sure, throughout your whole life to have the differences between you and your family. What was that like for you?
It's, looking back on it, what a strange process to have to assimilate to for a young child. Not only was I having to make sense of what's going on. Yesterday I was in Korea. I'm here, and then without the language, especially having to figure out, well, how do I survive here? So there's this sense that research suggests the process of reparation, and you can look at Dr. Amanda Baden's work. But to assimilate means essentially relinquish my birth culture, and whether I was pre-verbal or verbal, but I get the message that in order to touch and receive care, folks in my presence right now, I have to forget everything and don't speak Korean anymore, learn everything I can about the people that there is this notion that colonization, the transracial is seen as an extension of colonization, where adopters from colonizing nations adopt children of color from colonized nations. And that's from the work of Dr. Susan. I think Grace Newton kind of builds on that, adds to it, saying that the territory seized isn't land, but bodies. So as a elder, of course, I can't name this. And then as a youth, as a teen growing up, but I can sense it. I can feel it. And this is not to predict that we should go around feeling outcast, woe is me, victim mentality. But it wasn't until later on in my life that I had access to a sense of personal confidence, being comfortable in my skin, finally meeting the others who value to a racialized ethnic identity, that my connection to to Asian American communities is alive and can be be used for well-being. So that whole journey really didn't root, or I guess bear fruit, until later in my life. So growing up, it was somewhat isolating in the realm of trying to, who am I, where do I belong?
That sounds really complicated, a lot of layers for sure, and certainly more than, say, a domestic infant adoptee like me would have to have dealt with. And so we certainly appreciate learning more about the voices of international adoptees. Sometimes we hear about this different language of transnational, intercultural, international, intercountry adoptees. What is the preferred language for adoptees from another country right now? How do you self-refer?
Excuse me. I've heard it many different ways, and give space for adoptees to. I really appreciate that term, self-refer. I simply use international or traditional to refer to the fact that I was born in this other space, and then transracial to refer to the idea that I was raised by parents who have a different racial ethnic identity than me.
That's helpful. Thank you. And we do sometimes within the domestic adoptee community want to be as respectful of whatever is prevailing right now in the way, again, of self-reference, and do the most respectful thing, approach you in a state of wanting to learn and receive and hear what your voices are saying to us. So thank you for clarifying those points for me. So growing up as a young Korean adoptee, and you've, again, by the way, I very much appreciate Dr. Amanda Baden, and she's someone who's also been on Fireside. And I know she spoke a lot about these microfictions, et cetera, and the way that people can say things that are very invalidating to somebody of another culture. And she gave examples like, you speak very good English, or things like this. Did you encounter a lot of microaggressions and microfictions like that growing up?
Yeah, the term micro, an exchange between like a dyad, it's like between people, micro on a micro, as opposed to like macro level systemic institution realities. Microfic, it's this idea that there's a narrative or a slogan or a thought phrase that discredits or silences, erases the possibility of a deeper truth or a truth. Your mom loved you so much, she gave you up for adoption. Or if you would have grown up in Korea, you would have been poor, you would have been raised in poverty. And not to say that my parents explicitly said those to me, fictions like, and microaggressions, right? Where are you from? Where are you really from? Yeah, that I'm this sort of like perpetual foreigner. So all of those together, yeah, absolutely making sense of those. And then when we finally realize or discover that there's a name for these relational experiences, like, wow, I wasn't until I was an adult, till I kind of like embody this and really give voice to some of these feelings and reactions that I've had, and hearing that other people have experienced them too. There's work being done to decode that, to address that in broader society. Incredibly validating, life-giving, and inspirational, propelling me forward in the work that I do today.
the ability to see other people with similar backgrounds and similar stories, and having that kind of experience that was shared in the way you said it propelled you forward and gave you maybe a base or a foundation that you finally were able to articulate that. You sounds like had gained some language around this as well, coming in with having to have surrendered your very language, your all the ways you knew of yourself, even as a very young person. But to finally have a place where those can start to come together again, maybe the discovery of a community of people had to have been really transformational for you.
Mm-hmm. And I really love the way that you referred to language, because it reminds me of the language that adoptees co-create, that we've been co-creating through literature, through our testimony, lived experiences. Because it's like learning a new language to hear what is important to adoptees, to really press into the adoptee experience and learn from it. And some of this we're still having to develop as we go, and that's why it's so important to have dialogues like this, so that we can pay attention. And sometimes there's not always a clear one-sided term for something, but it is like a language. And that's why I hold to this idea of adoption literacy, and really promoting and cultivating that within the community, a larger and deeper awareness of the lived experience of adoptees, so that not only adoptees can gain access to resources, but those around us can be more invested in developing resources that don't exist yet, but are so desperately needed. And the more that we practice this language and continue to co-create that together, the more lives are going to be nourished as we continue making these resources available for everyone around us.
That's amazing. And yeah, the language is generative. It, as you said, we co-create it, but it also opens up conceptualities. We're learning to experience together, and deeper
Yes.
ways of getting into the interpreting our existence and what it means for us to be adoptees in the world, or in the world that a way it's experienced by you. So very much appreciate that. And I think it also gets to this idea of the narratives that are socially in place already about adoption. So I wrote down what you said, adoption literacy, which is a really great term here. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Excuse me. Yeah. The way for me to share with y'all with it that I have here, it really basically it's a posture. It's a sort of like relational skill set, and it's research informed, adoptee informed, and kind of like both a principle and a practice, tangible set of like tools that we can mobilize in the key to give voice, to enact this sort of like generative coalition building and intervention developing sort of idea. It began when I actually started working at adoptee camps. This was earlier on in the story, and up until then, I had never really considered that there could be more to this story than I was rescued. But all of a sudden, I'm volunteering as a camp counselor, hearing all of these questions from adoptees, and we're with one another. And like you said, when you're meeting the others, it's self-validating to self-represented in another person's story. There's also a will, because you're starting to learn, and you're like, wow, I've never really asked the question from that angle before. And now that I hear you ask it, something within me comes alive. It really resonates. And I got to figure this out too. But let's figure this out together. There's a community practice there. So I didn't have the official term for it then, but there are these components that, as a clinical counselor right now, it informs a lot of the work I do as a therapist, but also active within the community. So really saying, hey, there's more to the story. How can we humanize one another as adoptees? We're more than just rescued, grateful, and chosen gift from God that completes the family. How can we, the adoptee consciousness model of forgiveness and activism, we can look back at our lives and say, you know, people were doing the best they could with what they had. We can also advocate for accountability, for change in the system. And that's where we get like just ownership of our part in the story, whether that's macro part, little actions and decisions we can make on a daily basis, all the way up to attending meetings at City Hall, policy, legislative oversight, and really just elevating adoptees into positions of influence where not just the research subjects. And I get a lot of that from my mentor, or like adoptee elders like J. Ron Kim and Holly McGinnis, Amanda Baden. I was just at the International Conference on Adoption Research. Susan Bronco's doing great work too. Of like, adoptees are more than just the test subjects. You know, participants in these studies that have been designed and approved for mainly like what adoptive parents to conduct this research. And we're not saying we can't learn from that, but when we elevate adoptees into this, we have a more informed approach about articulating what's at stake, what kind of questions could we be asking, and it's coming from a more organic, street level lived experience when we're collecting data, when we're disseminating the data after we get the results, and making meaning of it as a community. So more of just being, I think Jaron calls it like forever observed, never the observer, or something like that. But we got to change that. So adoption literacy, just like learning language or whatever, financial literacy or something, says there are some new pathways that are available to us. And if we're willing to walk down those pathways, there's going to be a lot of hope for folks who are in desperate need of it right now at all ages and stages of the lifespan. 40, 50, 60, 70 years old adoptee. No, there are services that are relevant for you, and we need to collect that data.
That's really inspiring to hear, and it's encouraging. And I really liked what you said about, so we go from being these perpetual test subjects, and maybe the data that's collected isn't all that representative anyway. I noticed, for instance, the more recent studies, and I follow you on LinkedIn, and I see some of the interactions, and you're great at starting conversations about what do people think about a headline like this? What do you think about that? And I see the responses, and it's discouraging sometimes because it seems like there's a long way to go. But I also see how firmly and eloquently people like you are able to articulate this. But you must feel this pushback from society, right? They just maybe they don't want to believe us. It's often how it feels to me. Like, well, I know somebody who's fine, or I know somebody who had a good experience. You're just bitter or ungrateful, etc. You must face that every day, hearing and advocating the way you do.
Yeah, and for me, one of the things that keeps me going is just, I mean, obviously it's the right thing to do, but I've just talked with so many of the younger generation of adoptees, like through camps and the teen groups that I do, of like, if people are publicly pushing back against a credentialed, licensed professional clinical counselor, adoptee with lived experience in a public space, I can't imagine, and I don't want to, but I can't imagine the kind of pushback that an adoptee child is getting as we speak, behind closed doors in the four walls of their household. And those are what we're trying to go and support. Not that we're the rescuers or the saviors or the heroes, but they've got barriers they may be facing on their way to feeling confident and comfortable in their own skin, realizing their strengths and abilities, their capacity to contribute to the community and make changes in the world and do awesome things, right? How do we remove those barriers and invite those parents into conversations that are saturated with truth and hope?
Yeah, and it's really inspiring to hear, and it feels mobilizing too. I know it's not just rousing people's sentiment, but there are people, and there seem to be more boots on the ground among adoptees than previously. And I think people want to carry that message out there and hear it in very bold terms, articulation like what you've provided here. So at some point you moved into deciding your career would be in the therapy space. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that came about and what made you feel compelled to want to pursue that path.
Yeah. When I got back from working at summer camp, I was talking director, and this was like earlier on when I was just getting plugged into the adoptee community. I was like, where can adoptees get this kind of like environment and like where are the other groups throughout the year? And he basically said there aren't any. I'm sorry, we're trying to change that. Now, of course, I don't credit, like there were adult adoptees doing great work back then, and known as and goal on, but the idea will pair with my reunion trip in Korea and then coming back Korea and talking to my advisor on campus. Like, I think I need to invest in supporting the adoptee community somehow. I don't know what that looks like. What do you think about this? And he started walking different potential career options. And when we got to clinical counseling, it like lit a flame in me. Just started to put logs on the fire and talking about the ways that we can reach adoptees and advocate for their mental health and how closely that counseling is paired with social justice. Counseling isn't just sitting in a therapy room and listening. It's about changing the conditions in which our clients live with our therapy room. It's like, it's together. And I was like, yeah, that I need to be doing. That's where I need to be. So I started applying to grad school. Later, after the training and credentialing process, that's how I came to here in my private practice at therapy and really trying to do work. I'm always learning as well. That's go to conferences like the International Adoption Conference and hearing from adoptees. You have to have credentials for your testimony to be legit valid. But that's where I am, just trying to like work with adoptees one-on-one in things, speaking in workshops, organizations, and really just trying to make this public discourse accessible and available to anyone who's hungry for it or willing to join.
Great. So I hear from a lot of people who are looking for therapists that they have experience or bad experience finding a good fit or somebody they read a list of what the therapist specializes in, and maybe it says something about adoption, a little blurb, and they go in and they have, wow, that wasn't what I thought was going to happen. Maybe they sense and the interaction doesn't go smoothly, but there are certain ways, of course, then of being informed about adoption versus being competent or an adoptee competent therapist. So adoption competency versus, adoption competent versus adoptee competent. Are those terms that resonate with you or that you could elaborate upon?
Yeah. The certificate that I have is a postmaster's program called Permanency Adoption Competency Certificate. It's a 2-hour throughout like 12 months, and it provides this postmaster's training: loss, grief, trauma, birth search, identity, adult adoptee, and history of adoption, all of these different pieces. And that's important because that's like an adoptee specific modality, meaning that I'm not discounting therapist who specializes in grief, but if the therapist can't understand why an adoptee would grief, well, maybe we have some more conversations to have before we bring that adoptee in that person's clinic. And again, this is a learning. So it's really, I mean, ethically, as a clinic, we're really trying to say, hey, if what this person needs falls out of the scope of my practice and my knowledge, that's okay. I'm not going to take that because I'm a human being. I cannot learn all the things there are to learn. I just have that because I'm a human being. I can refer to my network of clinicians, colleagues who specialize in that. I can take training to improve, like in the meantime, improve my capacity to work with those clients. And that's where this like certificate comes in. Like, you have the ability to ask and really almost interview your therapist before working with them and just ask them, how do you incorporate the lived experience of adoption, the realities of adoption into conceptualizations of suffering, healing, a treatment plan, objective goals, interpersonal process, therapeutic law. What trainings have you taken? And just because someone is an adoptee doesn't that they would be the right fit for you, because there's intersectionality. We're not just a single kind of person. There are other facets or other of values that are important to you. And just because a person is an adoptee, maybe there are other pieces that they might not have yet. So it case by case scenario, and it's for me, it's a plug to you all to say you're allowed to do your search in that. If you look at Jatra, Word-alikers, Grow Beyond Words, Adoptee directory, I think she's been working on that website about 5 years. I think she said. Got a list of adoptee clinicians in every single state. And so whatever given, you can go to the Grow Beyond Words directory, you can find a therapist who most likely even do telehealth or virtual counseling for you. And you can get either on their wait list or an intake just on the phone and share a little bit more about what you're looking for, and give them a chance to share how they'd like to work with you. Just kind of explore that way. So that's available for y'all.
Well, thank you. I'm wondering, is in a very broad generalization, do you see a lot of older adoptees? Are there a lot of people just starting to process this and go, wow, that's my experience as somebody who's, literally weeks from being mid-50s, that I only came out of the adoption fog a few years ago, 3 years ago. And I found a lot of people in the same situation, baby scoop era adoptees, domestic adoptees, around 50 years old. Suddenly we're all here. And I wonder if you see a lot of people about in that age range who are just starting to unpack this.
Anecdotally, Greg, I can say that the clients that I serve currently are between like adolescents into their 30s and 40s, so mid-range. And like, I don't have my data, but that's generally the average age. What you're right now, it reminds me of Dr. Holly McGinnis is doing a project now currently as we speak, and colleagues, mapping the life course of Adoptee project. And forgive me if I said that wrong, but essentially the proposal, or the I'm blanking on the word, but the reason for this research is that there's a lot of data on adoptees in mid to late life stages. And because of I appreciate what Holly said during her presentation, that it's unethical to be conducting these child welfare practices without following up in a full qualitative, even quantitative way. But how is this working out for you? Physically, emotionally, cognitively, socially? We want to hear from you. And because there's a lack of data, maybe there's a lack of for screenings, care, and certainly targeted mental health modalities that serve or be specific to a population 50 and beyond. So that's something that, I'm encouraged that, you're here doing this work, because we need to be normalizing that whatever age you are, it's not, don't feel bad that it wasn't until you're like 50 that you started ask more of these questions. It's almost belief. And again, and we're not that people who aren't asking these questions, is we're not saying there's a right place to be an adoptee, but to say that, wow, now that I'm sort of like aware that adoption has an impact on my life in some significant, meaningful ways, now what? So, connection with other commuters, establishing safety in the relationships in your life, remembrance and mourning, finding ways to call upon that grief, not to just stay in it, but to engage that personal process within, to really allow of yourself to come out and breathe. And then potentially that sort of, we can't transcend an atrocity, but we can find a way to help it serve ourselves and those around us. And atrocity meaning like I can't help that I was adopted, was relinquished and adopted. I can't go back in time, but I don't want to stay stuck in this. What I can do is do that work with my therapist, really engage in that self-reflection, that personal process, and then invest in adoption literacy, in activism, in the ways that we're advocating. Like Minnesota, I think I just share this somewhere else. The 15th state to give adoptees access to their birth records. Legal. It's legal now. This is so, I mean, it's 24, got like 35 more states to go, but that's advocacy, activism. Had to like push for that. So that's that you're on that path, that we're on that path together.
How does a therapy for an adoptee contribute towards integration or wholeness for a person? What are the sorts of things they may need to work through?
It's important for me to say that like healing and wholeness for anyone is going to be a definition based on their specific lived experience. So I can't find necessarily like healing integration for someone. I think back the description of mental health by World Health Organization that says something like mental health is the ability to cope with the stressors of life, to learn well and work well, realize strengths and abilities, and contribute to the community. I think I even said that earlier today. Healing and wholeness intersects with the lived experience of adoption. We might ask, what it that I need to process my adoption story, trauma, relationships, loss, empowerment, what did I need to process in order for me to close the gap between what is and what could be? What is meaning maybe I'm a really hard time coping with stressors. Little thing is irritating me, or I haven't really anything in days. I just have zero motivation, or I'm constantly worried about what if this is going to happen, or is that going to happen? Is the body's response to a future threat. Maybe there are some ways that I struggle in relationships, interpersonal processes. So healing in just the broad use of the term would be working together, either formally or informally, with someone you trust to why is it a struggle? Where does that come from? And how is that a protective interpersonal style? Or how does it serve you to be worried? How does it keep you safe to be aware that XYZ could happen? So let's stay away from that. It's just, and I mean, obviously, this is anecdotal. Working with a therapist really allows us to get honest and examine some of the core underpinnings of our behaviors, not shameful, guilt-driven way, but really in a posture of curiosity and revelation. And the more that we can reveal and witness those parts about ourselves, the more responsibilities that we can take. In a punitive way of like, oh my gosh, you're responsible for the stuff. Responsibility meaning locus of control, that I have control over the way that the events of my life will unfold, that I have or to participate in the way this is going to turn out. That's what I mean by responsibility. So in the book, I talk about the merging of revelation and responsibility, and therapy can help untangle that process.
So a restoration of agency in a way, right? A person's ability to shape their future.
Yeah, I like that. You nailed it.
Very powerful. So the therapists who do work with adoptees, and let's say somebody goes to them and again have said, "Wow, I thought I would be interacting in a different way with somebody." How do more therapists, or first of all, what do you think keeps more therapists from knowing about specifically what adoptees struggle with? Is it really a matter of training, or is it pressure from society to think about adoption a certain way?
We're up against a few things. Like I think there's, the lack of training potentially comes from the lack of trainers or the lack of training programs. The lack of training programs comes from a lack of perceived need for the program. We won't know that we need this program unless somehow there's evidence or data to suggest that we need it. Well, there's a lack of evidence and data because academia is a very gated community. And also, just that culture in general is informed by some of these dominant adoption narratives. Love conquers all. Adoption is love. Time heals all wounds. Or adoption is in the best interest of the child. That's it. I love what Dr. Gina said during a presentation last week at the conference, that safety plus permanence does not equal well-being. The problem is that we think it does, and that we've never, I'm not saying that there's no one that does this, but to answer your question, I believe that the more clinicians, the universities, the more people invest, the more that they can say or ask, is there more to well-being besides permanence and safety? If so, what could that be? Then I think we'd start to have more motivation and resources available for clinicians to gain more insight about what an adoptee is going through, even though they have safety and permanence in their life. And we're projecting. We're not saying that all adoptees have this emotional turmoil or psychological distress. We're just saying safety and well-being, safety and permanence doesn't equal well-being. If that's the formula or the values, the ethos that the clinical community is working on, well, then of course we wouldn't invest in any kind of adoptee specific clinical resource. That was a long-winded answer, but
That's a good answer. It's very helpful. Thank you. All of these things are so thoughtful, the way you're responding to them. You've had a chance to be featured a couple places that I've seen, some media appearances, which can carry, I think, a big, wow, people are going to be listening to me, right? And many of us will not necessarily have that sort of opportunity. What are the sorts of things you think the public or the people interviewing you are surprised to hear or learn, or you find them receptive to what you're saying? How are you able to use that platform or those opportunities?
Mm-hmm. I think it's twofold, at least. One is that I've been fortunate enough to where people who are interviewing me or the folks that invite me into that particular space, they're familiar enough with my work to know that I'm going to say what I'm going to say. They already know my position or my just overall posture, my stance on things about mental health, adoption, responsibility. So they're inviting conversation. That's number one. And then number two, I see my role in those spaces. I want to be very careful with it, and I want to honor just the privilege that it comes with. So how can I accomplish two things? Number one, say something that I would say uniquely that like only Cam would say. And I'm not saying that in a way, but I mean, if you know what I mean, I'm like, well, I'm going to say what's on my mind in my own personality or whatever. No, that's one. And then the second one is I want to usher folks and connect people to the shared consciousness, the shoulders of giants on which I stand, the research, the voices that propel and inspire me. I want to usher them into the present moment as well and connect them. So it's like, I'm going to share my message, but I'm also like trying to say there are all of these voices over here, and there's all of this like research and information that is critical to the way that we move forward. My job isn't necessarily to like parrot back to you everything that they've said or give you like a verbal Google Drive, but it at least give you like verbal hyperlinks to let you know, the audience, that they exist. Please go check it out. And if you don't, you're missing out. But I just want to usher you into their presence to say, hey, you meet you. You guys work it out. Have fun. That's really how I kind of see that role. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like a connector role, right?
Yes. Yes. I love that.
And it's almost like an ambassador role. People have invested a certain level of confidence in you and view you authoritatively to say, okay, I hear that, and now I listen to what he's saying here. It's like a transitive role of passing something on to someone else. I think it's wonderful, and I feel like it's a great idea because, as you said, not everybody can know everything or be great at everything, but you may know people who are great in other areas.
Yes.
People need to know about them.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. So how may people reach you, and what kind of resources would you recommend that they look up?
I can be reached at the Instagram handle at Therapy Redeemed, my website, which is therapyredeemed.com/WordPress. It's a WordPress site, main website there. And they can email me if you have questions, therapyredeemed@gmail.com. And yes, I do have the LinkedIn account. I think you can just search for my name. I actually can't remember what the title is there. And then there's also a facebook.com/therapy redeemed. So a few different avenues to connect with me, and I love hearing from you. I don't always get to folks right away because I have a high volume of stuff coming in, and kind of a one-person show. So I'm literally answering every email personally back when I can. So in advance, I really thank people for their patience. But I'm so encouraged by people reaching out. So thank you for that.
Thank you. You've been wonderful to set this up. I know it's been a couple months in the making to get together like this. So your time is valuable, and we honor and respect that. And thank you so much for coming to deliver this to us. It's certainly been very thought-provoking, and I hope people will see that there's still so many things to explore and learn from all these different angles, but it's really been an encouraging talk. So I want to thank you, Cam, for coming and speaking to us today.
Right on. Thanks to Greg and Amanda for having me here. Appreciate it.
Amanda too, yeah. So this will, in just a second here, conclude the recording section of our call here. For anybody who's been in the gallery or who will find us on Fireside Adoptees YouTube channel, you'll see this great interview with Cam and other ones, and we hope to see you again, everyone. Thanks for attending here.